The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
At 96, after 70 years and 214 days as our monarch, Queen Elizabeth II died today. She was the longest-serving British monarch, the only monarch most of us have ever known. Queen of the Commonwealth through turbulent times, Queen during the repatriation of Canada's Constitution. Her legacy cannot be overstated. With us now to begin to reflect on that, we're joined by the Crown's representative in this province, the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, Elizabeth Dowdeswell. John Fraser, founding president of the Institute for the Study of the Crown in Canada and author of The Secret of the Crown, Canada's Love Affair with Royalty. And in Maple Ridge, British Columbia, Barbara Messamore, professor of history at the University of the Fraser Valley, and in our nation's capital, Akash Maharaj, governor of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. And I'm really grateful to everybody tonight for changing your plans on short notice so that you could be with us for this live and very special broadcast to look at a singular moment in history. And I need to start with, I was just thinking about this before we got on the air. I know thousands of people. I only know one person in this whole world who's had a private audience with Her Majesty the Queen, and that's you. I'm going to ask you more about that in a second, but I first want to know, how does the Queen's representative in the province of Ontario get the news that Her Majesty has passed away?
Well, let me say, first of all, that it's news that I never wanted to happen on my watch.
Right.
It was not the way my day started, and I certainly didn't expect things to move as quickly as they did. We'd been watching during the course of the morning, a very busy morning, and I was doing the regular events on my schedule, and I found out when one of my staff said it had just been announced on television, first of all, and then we had official news from Rideau Hall.
And given that you weren't expecting this news today, what immediately was in your head and in your heart?
There wasn't much in my head. It was mostly in my heart. It's been a very sad day. And I think that's true for many, many people in this province. I think people are surprised at their emotional reaction. You know, we all knew at 96 that clearly Her Majesty would not be with us forever. But when she had just performed constitutional duties this week, no one, I think, dreamt that it would happen so suddenly. And so you do cast back and remember stories from the past. For me, I have many stories to recall, and we'll do that later.
We sure will.
But it's been a remarkable year because we have been able to hear the stories from all over the province. We chose to celebrate, commemorate 70 years of service of Her Majesty by being out amplifying how, particularly places in rural Ontario, were remembering Her Majesty all summer long, and how much they wanted their kids to know about those stories.
John, it's an odd thing to say that we're shocked when we get the news of a 96-year-old dying, but I saw that over and over today. People kind of in shock, as if they kind of expected her to live forever. How did you see it?
I wasn't shocked for a number of reasons, but I was in awe. Actually, that's the word I'd like to use, in awe of the passage, because this was a monument. Apart from the human being that was there, this was a monument that passed, and for most Canadians, was the only sovereign. I'm afraid I keep hearing that, and I have to remember, well, I actually remember when we used to sing God Save the King in grade school, but I do remember the coronation very vividly. So that's, and for me, to think that 70 years ago, that was the thoughts at the beginning of the Jubilee. Her passage is also a great arc in our country's life. It's not just the passage of time. She was actually Queen of Canada for virtually half of our post-Confederation history. I mean, think of that.
It's a long time.
Yeah.
Barbara, let me get you in here. When you got the news, what was in your head? What was in your heart?
Well, I suppose that it seemed in some way that the Queen's end would come in a week full of service, that she had no time at which she wasn't dedicated to the service of the Commonwealth, and the idea that just on Tuesday that she had met with Britain's incoming Prime Minister Liz Truss, and that her duties carried forward right to the end like that. It seems remarkable and in many ways very fitting, since she dedicated her life to duty and to service.
Akash, I heard somebody earlier today say, knowing her dedication to service, she hung in there just long enough to make sure that she could meet her 15th Prime Minister. You think there's anything to that?
I'd like to think there is, and certainly it does provide an appropriate coda to her life. When she first took on the crown, in her initial speech, she said that she would dedicate her life to public service. And I don't think there's anyone who would disagree with the statement that she succeeded admirably in that. Her entire life has been one of public service. Even before she took on the role of Queen, we all know the story about the fact that she, as a young woman, became a mechanic in the armed forces during the Second World War. I don't think many people appreciate how unusual that is. It wasn't expected. It was actually a little bizarre. To the best of my knowledge, she is the only female member of the royal family ever to enroll in the armed forces in anything other than a ceremonial role, in a way that perhaps was normal when she was a young woman, but has become all too rare today. She really has lived out the ideal that to lead is to serve.
Your Honor, I want to circle back to the first thing I mentioned about you, which is the fact that you're the only person I know who's had a one-on-one audience with the Queen. I gather you have to present your credentials when she welcomes you as the new Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. Tell us as much as you possibly can about that meeting that you're allowed to say.
Well, it's a gift that every Lieutenant Governor gets, which is an audience with Her Majesty, usually within the first year of your service. I had asked some people, knowledgeable people, as to what I should expect. And the answer I got was, don't worry about it at all, because the only thing that she will be trying to do is to make you feel comfortable. And that indeed was true. She was warm, generous, humorous, and that was very welcoming. We talked, people had also told me that she would know my file better than I did at that point in time. And sure enough, her first question was actually about a visit that I had made to KI on Big Trout Lake. She knew about that, and she was puzzled because she couldn't pronounce the name of the First Nation. And then she'd laugh at herself. But we talked, our very first conversation was actually about Indigenous peoples, which I think is fascinating.
Did that surprise you?
No, because I think treaty signing and between Indigenous people and the Crown is just such an important feature of how she believed her Canada functioned. And certainly for me, understanding how one witnesses, no matter that you have no control, no power at all over decision-making, how you could perform that role in a way that respected what she felt about the relationship. And to me, the word that was so prominent was kinship.
Interesting. How long was your meeting?
I think it was 30 minutes, maybe.
Wow, long time.
Yeah, something like that. It was absolutely wonderful.
And when you
we
left
also talked about the arts. She was very interested in Canadian artists.
When you walked out of the room, did your feet touch the floor?
You know, I must tell you a side story, and that is, I'm an immigrant. I was born in Belfast, and when we came to Canada, a feature of our home was always Queen Elizabeth. It was something that was very important to my mother, who had a remarkable resemblance to the Queen Mother, actually. But I was known as Lilibet because I couldn't pronounce Elizabeth as a child either. And the story is widely told of watching the coronation from the front row of a church seat, a front pew, and my father saying something about Queen Elizabeth, and my being quite intemperate and saying, Lilibet, that's Lilibet, in the middle of the service. A well-kept secret.
Very nice. John, you met her too, didn't you?
I was a journalist like you, and so I've met her on quite a number of occasions on that level. And as you know, that's anodyne. You don't get to have substantial conversations. I once had the privilege of being invited to a private birthday party of a neighbor of the Queen's in a house that they rented from the Queen. It was the house where Edward VIII signed the abdication. And so it was a very small, intimate gathering of about 200 people. But at one point, there was a fireworks display. And I went up to the front of this viewing station with my wife. And my wife said to me, "Do you know who we're standing beside?" And I turned around and I said, "Good evening, Your Majesty." And she said, "Well, this is going to be loud, isn't it?" And the fireworks went off, and this was a fancy party. There was a string orchestra playing, things like the 1812 Overture as the fireworks went off. And I noticed one thing that I thought was really revelatory was that when they went up and it looked like ashes were coming down, the Queen would go like this to her hair, and the permanent would bounce right back. So I knew that was steel-plated hair that had served service for all those years. But I asked her how old she was when she first came to stay or visit Belvedere, Fort Belvedere, which was the home of Prince Edward, the Prince of Wales, who became Edward VIII briefly. And she said she was just a very young girl, but it was the loveliest place in the world because there was no protocol. She could run around the place that had the only first heated swimming pool in England, and she said it was complete freedom, and my Uncle David let us do anything we wanted. And then she paused, and this has haunted me ever since. She said, "That was a really great tragedy, what happened." And I thought, oh my God, this is the family story. And then another firecracker went off, and the person on the other side. So I didn't get to push on in the conversation, but I did ask her before we left. It was Saturday, and I said, my wife and I wanted to go to church, and you're the head of my church. What church should we go to? You must know the local parishes. She looked at me. She said, "I know them all." She said, "Well, you better turn up at St. George's Chapel, but be there by 11:15 because they won't let you in if you're late."
That is hysterical. Look at this. She was very real in her conversation
Totally
with you.
real. And she was with everyone there. I mean, she is cocooned and protected by people like us to some extent. I mean, if we love the crown and the Queen, but she's also, through 70 years, she's been exposed to just about everything. It's just extraordinary how she's maintained her equilibrium. What did Prince Philip say? She was forbearing to a fault. I think that's true.
Akash, did you meet her as well?
I did, quite briefly, when I was head of Canada's national equestrian team. And she has a great love of horses, as is widely known. It was a brief conversation, but I have to say, she carried it off magnificently well. What I mean by that is that I'm conscious of the fact that until 30 seconds before we spoke, she neither knew nor cared who I was. And likely 30 seconds after our conversation was over, she'd forgotten everything that we had said and had moved on to the next person. But during that brief period when we were speaking, anyone observing us would have thought that he was watching a reunion of two old friends. She was very well briefed. She asked me about the sport I competed in. She asked me about my wife by name. And as much as I knew that she was weaving into the conversation details that she had been passed by one of her aides, I was very impressed. I was impressed because, notwithstanding the fact that I knew what this was about, she really was carrying it off well. I think that what has caused her to be the kind of person who touches people when they met her was that people expect a monarch to be someone whose job is to be someone special. I think that she recognized that her job was to make other people feel special, and she certainly did that with me.
I'm going to read, Barbara, something from The Guardian today, written by a former royal correspondent named Stephen Bates, and then I'll get you to comment on that if we can. Sheldon, if you would, the graphic. Her reign encompassed a period that saw some of the greatest changes in technological development, industrial, economic, and social life across the world of any era. Yet it is hard to see her name being bestowed, as her predecessor Queen Victoria's was, as the defining symbol of an age. Instead, she played, largely impeccably, the part of a modern constitutional monarch, a symbolic figurehead with a right to be consulted and to advise and warn political leaders privately, and to show herself publicly as a focus of national life, celebration, and commemoration. So let's assume, Barbara, we're having this conversation in 100 years, and they are referring back to the second Elizabethan age. What are they going to say about it?
Yes. Well, perhaps the fact that there have been so many changes, the accelerating pace of change, there's no one characteristic that you can say marks that age, as we might say about earlier ages. I think the sense of the Queen's constitutional role, how important that is, and how much to most people, when they think of the Crown, they think of the Queen. We conflate those things. The Crown has its function and people who carry out the duties of the Crown. Her Honor, of course, is among us today, and the other Lieutenant Governors and the Governor General. There's no chain of command about how those duties are carried out. I think that, that constitutional role is something that she made concrete just with her longevity. And so we conflate those two things. We think of the Crown as the Queen. And of course, the Crown's just at the center of everything. It's at the kind of the functional heart of our parliamentary system, as Her Honour's mentioned. When we think about relations with Indigenous people, both those who've taken treaty and those who haven't, those treaties are made in the name of the Crown. We go back to the important Royal Proclamation of 1763, something that, of course, wasn't an act of piece of legislation, but rather a proclamation by George III, the thing that recognized what we today call Aboriginal title. So many ways that the Crown is at the center.
Jean, I want to ask you, the former journalist, I think she's the most famous person in the world never to have given an interview. I don't think she ever gave an interview in her 70 years on the throne. And I'm kind of curious as to if you ever did manage to get her for a one-on-one,
no.
What would you...
What would I do?
What would you ask? Yeah.
I don't think I'd be very comfortable. I think I would want to know more of what she was hinting at about the tragedy, because I think that I've been haunted by that statement, because I think it led to her father becoming king and dying young under the strain of it, and her not really having much of a life that she might have hoped to have. I think it's really interesting that she and her son have made sure that William and Catherine have something close to a kind of life that she never had. That was one of the lessons that she learned. But
we have to remember it was a kind of it's a quirk of history that she became a monarch in the first place, right? She was. Maybe you should explain that story for those who don't know. She never was meant to be queen.
No, she was the heir, though, because her uncle, who was the Prince of Wales, wasn't yet married, had no children, and so the next in line of the throne would be her father, the eldest brother, and then her. But the expectation would have been that the Prince of Wales would have married and had children, and she would be safe and be a wonderful country woman with horses and her farms and do everything that she liked doing. But she didn't get offered that. She got offered what I would call a constitutional straitjacket and a steely resolve to do her duty. I mean, it's one of the most extraordinary performances of the 20th century, what that woman managed to do, right to the very, very end.
Your Honor, I want to take you back to a moment that you had earlier today when you got the news of the Queen's passing, and you were doing your viceregal duties at the time, signing a bill that had been passed by the Ontario legislature. Tell me about that moment.
It was actually the most remarkable moment. I'd had a standing request for royal assent, and we do that in our music room. And I was there with several cabinet ministers. And I had been watching the media, so I knew what was happening, but we had no news. So I went in and did royal assent. I nodded, and then I decided to comment on the day. The quietness of the day, the somberness of the day. And I asked all those present to think about how remarkable this day really was. And I did that all before I actually signed. I finished signing and welcomed newcomers to the suite, and they left, and I got the word. that as I was signing, she was passing, the announcement of her passing had come. It's the most remarkable story. I will, a moment I'll never forget. Certainly it was the last act in this jurisdiction and possibly in any other jurisdiction as she was passing.
Well, that's what I was going to say. You may have signed in her name the very last law ever passed while she was alive.
Indeed.
All right. Akash, come in on this. Having reached the age of 96, as has been pointed out, she was around for nearly half of our post-Confederation existence. What do you think Canada lost today when Queen Elizabeth died?
Well, this isn't just the end of an era, which has become a cliche to say. This is the end of the only era the vast majority of us have ever known. I think that we've lost a connection to our past. And I think that I won't say that we've been cut adrift. That's not the case. But I think that we've now been thrown into an era when we will have to ask questions about the nature of our political apparatus that no living person in Canada has had to ask or had to engage with in a truly meaningful way before. When I think about, I live in Ottawa, and when I think about the protests that came to Ottawa earlier this year, without going into the details of them, one thing that really did remain with me is that we have catastrophically poor civics education in our country. So those protesters, as sincere as they might have been in their beliefs, had a wildly twisted idea of how our system works. I do worry that that is more common than I would have expected, and that the debate that will now unfold after her death and the ascension, which has already happened, of Charles as king, whatever regnal name he takes, will happen in a context where people will be encouraged to think about what is it that the monarchy means to us? Are there alternatives to the monarchy? But at a time when we are ill-prepared to do that as a society, and at a time when our political leaders have been, I'm going to say, negligent in introducing those questions into public discourse. To a certain extent, Elizabeth II made us very comfortable our entire lives. We are now about to enter a period of discomfort, and it will take great leadership, not just leadership from above, but leadership from below, from citizens, to take us into the next chapter. I have no idea what that chapter will be like, but it cannot possibly be like the last chapter.
Yeah, we will talk about that next chapter a little bit further on in our discussion. But let's, Sheldon, can we just do this right now? Let's scroll through a bunch of pictures here because Her Majesty, of course, had many, many trips, I think almost 24 trips to Canada during the course of her reign. Here's Nova Scotia in 1959, quite a youngster at the time. We are sitting here talking in the William G. Davis studio at TVO. So, of course, we need a picture of Her Majesty and Bill Davis. And there they are, the two of them together. And I'm going to come back.
Dressed, Mr. Davis.
Yes, indeed. And I'm going to talk about another episode that happened on that trip in just a moment. Her last visit to Toronto, Ontario's capital city, was in 2010. And there she is there with, of course, many admirers on hand. If you go to Queen's Park right now, you will see a wonderful exhibit dedicated to Elizabeth, not Elizabeth Dowdeswell, although I'm sure you would sign on to it, but Elizabeth II, on the to pay tribute to her 70 years on the throne. She came here a lot. She must have liked Canada to come here so much. Fair to say?
Absolutely.
You ever, during your meeting together, did she talk about how much she appreciated Canada?
Absolutely. She was curious about Canada, and her love of the country shone through in everything she said and did. I remember being at the opening of Canada House, the revamped Canada House, where she was present on a couple of occasions. And one of the things that she noticed was one of Charlie Pachter's flags right in the entryway. Yeah. And he was there and met her at that time. And she laughed about his stories of the Queen and the Moose.
There's another great moment, John, where she laughed, and I don't think we have the picture of it, but Sheldon, let's put up picture number 4 right now. This is, let's go back to 1981, or I guess it's April 82. Constitution agreed to in 81, and then she comes to Parliament Hill in April of 82 and makes it official. And there she is with the current Prime Minister's father on Parliament Hill, making official our repatriated Constitution. There was a moment, John, where she was signing, or I guess maybe Jean Chrétien was signing as our Minister of Justice, and the nib on the pen broke. And he said a little profanity en français. And she thought it was hysterical, and she laughed. And that was the picture that got snapped that was on many of the pages. She did love Canada, though, didn't she?
Oh, she did. Have you ever had Mark Carney on this show?
Of course, yeah.
Well, Mark Carney told me that he was told when the Queen was told that a Canadian was to be the next governor of the Bank of England, she said, "Good, Canadians are sensible." Well, some Canadians are. But she did. And her family loves this country. You know how many place names in Canada are rooted in the royal family? It's quite extraordinary, including the place I go to a cottage, Georgian Bay. And the thing about Her Majesty was the details she knew about this country. The fact that she spoke both her official languages, often better than some of our leaders. She just did. And the fact that she just had a sort of encyclopedic knowledge of basic Canada. And as Akash pointed out, she knew how to deploy it. She was brilliant. There's also an interesting political thing that she did, which only came out a year or so ago. There was a book came out about the Queen and the Commonwealth, and she was not above a little bit of playing the game. You know, she was hoping to come at the invitation of Pierre Trudeau to the Commonwealth Leaders Conference in Ottawa, and the Prime Minister of the day was Edward Heath, who basically disliked the Commonwealth and was pushing for Britain to be in the European Union. And he advised her not to come because Idi Amin, the troublesome African leader, was coming, and he didn't think it was appropriate for the Queen. And she was apparently sufficiently irritated to consult her Canadian Prime Minister on what she should do. And she was able to trump her British Prime Minister with her Canadian Prime Minister. And I heard from Esmond Butler, who was Secretary to Governor General Michener at the time, that one of the things when she came is that she was particularly gracious of the Queen, as the Queen of Canada, to Edward Heath, the visitor. Is what I heard.
Very nice.
Can I interrupt
Please.
for just one moment? Yeah. When you mentioned the Commonwealth, I think it's really important to also recall how much she nurtured the Commonwealth as a family. I remember a long conversation with the former Executive Secretary of the Commonwealth, Sir Sonny Ramphal. He regaled me with tales of the stories behind the scenes. But what he impressed upon me was how important those new emerging leaders of fledgling democracies were, particularly on the African continent, and how very important the family was, and how much, as John said, how much she relied on places like Canada to support her in that understanding.
Barbara, I want to take you back to the 1984 visit by Her Majesty to the province of Ontario. We saw the picture earlier of Bill Davis shepherding her around. There was a moment during that visit that probably was the most scandalous in the history of our province. And that is, there was a cabinet minister by the name of Jim Snow, who's got a highway named after him, starting in Oakville and going north, the James Snow Parkway. And James Snow, as he was taking over duties from Mr. Davis to shepherd her around, touched her back. And that picture went all over the world as a grand scandal. Would you care to bring us up to speed on what the big foofara about that all was?
I think that's considered a breach of protocol regardless. I guess, can I just add one comment? When we were talking about the Commonwealth, I think it does kind of go back to Akash's comments about civic literacy and understanding our systems of government and things like that. That I think the fact that in 1994, when Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa, that one of his first acts was to rejoin South Africa to the Commonwealth, that they had been severed the link with the Commonwealth because of the racist policy of apartheid. And so the fact that the Commonwealth stands for positive values, good governance, things like this. And so when we do contemplate our shared monarchy, I think that's one thing to think about, whether, what problems might we be trying to fix? Is there some reason that we feel the need for a change? And then people can talk about the practical difficulties of change. But also, I mean, the fact that you showed the picture of the signing of the Constitution in 1982, the proclamation ceremony. I think that was an important moment. That I think the clear message there was that you can have complete legislative autonomy, and that's compatible with a shared monarchy. So sorry, I've drifted from your point about
no, it's okay. We're going to let
protocol.
We'll let Jim Snow's breach of protocol go on now. Since we're on with the Commonwealth, Akash, I'll put a follow-up to you on that. Her Honour's right. The Queen made great efforts to turn what was a colonial empire into a friendly Commonwealth. Here we are all these years later. Would you opine on whether or not you think she was successful in doing that?
I think she was. I think she was definitely successful. And the key to her success was that she clearly thought of herself as the Queen, not just of the United Kingdom ruling over other countries. She thought of herself as the Queen of each of those countries equally. I should mention that during my 10-minute conversation with her, she did remark on the fact that I was wearing a Canadian equestrian team pin on my lapel. And I said to her, well, I'm a proud Canadian. And she laughed and she said, so am I. And I think that she meant that. I think she meant it very sincerely. There's no denying that the history of the British Empire is entwined with racism and colonialism and the Anglo-American slave trade. To deny that is to deny reality. But we are, all of us, products of history. We need not be prisoners of history. And I think the fact that she, as head of the Commonwealth, modeled equanimity between each of the countries where she was head of state and the countries where she was where her relationship was as head of the Commonwealth, I think that was remarkably powerful. It's the kind of quiet diplomacy in which she excelled. I do think that there are some people who will never look at the Commonwealth and see anything other than the worst in its history. But I think that she gave the Commonwealth a chance to shine. She gave the Commonwealth a chance to showcase the best in its history. And more pointedly, the sense that the Commonwealth doesn't just have a history, that it has a future. I can think of few people who would have been able to carry that off.
John Fraser, when I have troublesome questions, I come to you. There will appropriately be a great deal of praise for Her Majesty today. But if we're going to tell the full story, we need to remind people that when Princess Diana died, many people thought she put a bad foot forward. The royal family has seen its moments of trouble over the years. One of her sons has a very unfortunate connection to a guy named Jeffrey Epstein. There have been hard moments for this family, as there are for all families, but not all families are under the microscope like that one is. How well do you think she navigated all of that?
Quite well, actually. And you didn't even mention the fact that she once came to Quebec and everyone there turned their backs on her and booed her.
Right.
And she managed that quite well, too. I think Akash actually said something very important earlier about the kind of discussions and the questions we'll ask in the wake of Her Majesty's death. But it is incumbent for Canadians who, as Akash said, are not well versed in their civics to understand that the Queen is not there because she imposed, or the King Charles is not there because they impose themselves upon us. They're there because of the will of the Canadian people. If there was a will in the Canadian population for compelled the federal government and 10 provinces to not want to be governed under a monarchical system, it would end almost overnight. But it's unlikely to happen because you know as well as I do to try and get 11 legislatures to agree on almost anything. It's almost impossible, and there's so many other issues that are important. And maybe people will dwindle into an understanding of how lucky we are. The ups and downs of the family, as long as the head of it knows his or her constitutional duty, are almost irrelevant. They're products of, I'm afraid, our profession that sometimes has a low end. I do have to tell you that once I took Prince Philip around Massey College, which I once ran, and we got to the journalism fellows that are there, and he just looked at them. He said, "What do they do?" And I said, "Well, sir, it's like the Neiman fellows, Harvard. They get a year off from work, and they can study and do things and visit." He said, bit of a holiday then, is it, chaps?" And we kept walking, and under his breath, he said, bit of a holiday for your victims, too. That family has been subjected to some of the dark side of our profession, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, but they have withstood it, and withstood it in an age that, I mean, if you want to look at our age, the age of journalism, of snooping, gone from deference when the Queen was crowned to the period that we're in now, and yet they survived.
Well, Barbara, we've just got a few minutes left here, but I think we do need to think about what Charles III, which I must confess I had never heard before today, Charles III, what he has in store for him now. We know that there are many Commonwealth countries that have been toying with the idea of getting rid of the monarchy as soon as Her Majesty died. Well, we're there now. What's on his plate?
Yes. Well, I think that, clearly he'll put his own stamp on things. Every monarch does. I can recall a few years ago him making it known that he'd wish to be considered, for example, the defender of the faiths rather than the defender of the faith, that recognizing the multicultural character of the Commonwealth and, of course, of Britain, too. And I think that clearly he carries a great deal of baggage. But I think I would believe that most people recognize the continuity of the function of the crown. We say the Queen is dead, long live the King. And this to me is very meaningful, that the function carries on. We have what I like to think of as a crowdsourced constitution, something that's grown organically throughout our history, that has been built upon traditions. It isn't kind of the fruit of a single scheme that somebody's come up with. And things like that tend to be very robust and flexible. They can endure a few mistakes, and I'm sure there will be some. But I think that Charles has been preparing a lifetime for this role. He knows the role and what's expected of him, and I suspect he'll be equal to it.
I am going to give our vice-regal representative here the last word. That's Tina Zavagno. She's our floor director here, and when she runs out of fingers, we have to call it a night. So she tells me we got a minute left here. What are your concerns, hopes, worries for King Charles III right now?
Well, let me say, first of all, that it has been the most profound privilege to be Her Majesty's representative over these past number of years, and I will serve our new king in the same fashion. But I hope that what we will remember from Her Majesty is more the way she did things. I hope that we pay tribute to her and continue to pay tribute by being constant and caring, nurturing, and kind. And those were all characteristics that she displayed, and I think that's why we see the remarkable pouring out of admiration for her. And I hope people will give our new king a similar chance.
Right to time. Thank you, Your Honor. Thanks, everybody else.
Thank you,
It's been
Steve.
an astonishingly extraordinary day. Thank you for being part of it with us.
Yesterday, the Bank of Canada hiked interest rates for the 5th time this year in a bid to keep inflation under control. But every action leads to reaction, and for consumers pinched by higher costs, they're wondering where this is all headed. With us now for their thoughts in St. Adolphus, Doward, Quebec, Sheila Block, a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And here in studio, Benjamin Tal, Deputy Chief Economist of CIBC World Markets. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in studio as well. Now, the Bank of Canada increased interest rates another 0.75 yesterday. David Parkinson from the Globe and Mail wrote this. Before Wednesday, the key rate of 2.5% was right in the middle of the 2 to 3% range that the central bank considers neutral, in which rates neither stimulate nor restrain the economy. all the bank had achieved with all of its rate hikes up to that point was to remove the monetary policy stimulus put in place early in the COVID-19 crisis and stop actually stoking the economy and, by extension, inflation with its interest rates. Benjamin, I want to come to you first. What is the significance of the Bank of Canada achieving neutral territory?
It's very significant because the Bank of Canada has to maintain its credibility. For the past 40 years, the Bank of Canada, the Fed in the US, established their credibility as inflation fighters. They're not going to toss it away. And that's why it's important to understand that it's not really about inflation. At the end of the day, it's about the cost of bringing inflation down to target, which is 2%. And this cost is higher and higher interest rates. And that's why the Bank of Canada is trying to convince you and me that they mean business, namely inflation expectations. They want to make sure that inflation expectations, as opposed to the 70s, are not going to rise. If you look at those expectations, they're determined by 4 prices: the price of milk, bread, of course, beer, and gasoline prices. And all the information is coming from social media. That's considered to be the most significant source of information, social media. Now, the good news, the Bank of Canada has a Twitter account. The bad news is that nobody's following them. And that's why they have to actually show us and demonstrate that they mean business. And that's why raising interest rates and maybe even overshooting is extremely important at any point in time. If you give the Bank of Canada 2 choices, inflation expectations rising or a recession, they will take a recession any day. And that's more or less where we are.
All right, Sheila, I want to get your thoughts on that.
So I absolutely agree with Benjamin. I think that the Bank of Canada is absolutely will choose a recession over sustained inflation. I think where we may differ is that while I think absolutely these interest rate increases will result in more likely to result in an inflation, I don't know how effective it will be in actually reducing inflation, because these are not these inflation rates very much so have to do with international factors, with the COVID-19 pandemic, with the war in Ukraine, and with the climate crisis. And I am doubtful that we will see the desired effect from these policies.
So it's fair to say you don't think that this rate hike will do the trick in bringing inflation down from 7.6 in July to the bank's target of 2 to 3%.
This rate hike on its own absolutely can't do it. The bank itself, I think, is expecting that that more rate hikes will be required. There has been sort of the 18 to 24 month lag in terms of the impact of it. And so what we will see, I think, is a lot of economic pain. And as a result of that, we will see some slowdown in the rate of inflation. But those rate increases won't have an impact on those external factors. And the mechanics have really shifted from the last time the bank engaged in this kind of shock and awe in the 1980s and in the 1990s.
Well, I actually agree. I think that about 60 to 65% of inflation that we're facing now is coming from outside the country. That's the supply chain that everybody is talking about. And 40% is actually the housing market and all the rest domestically, what the Bank of Canada can actually control. Now, the supply chain issue is, there are 2 issues here. One is demand. You know, in 2001, we were shopping like there is no tomorrow. We squeezed 4 years of consumptions into 1 year because it was easy. You press a button and you get your exercise bike. It was equivalent in the US, this huge increase in consumptions of goods, not services, that you overnight parachuted 75 million Americans into the US. And the minute they landed, they started to shop.
Right.
We are talking about a supply chain issue that is dealing with the mother of all demand shocks. And then you have, of course, a sick supply chain because of obvious reasons. A lot of it has to do with COVID. And that's why the assumption about COVID is very, very important. It's still with us. In the US, there are 16 million people with long COVID. So we definitely have to realize that something is happening here. And I'll give you one number. The number is 3.14. Go back to grade 7 geometry. The number is pi.
Right.
Pi is the next Greek letter after Omicron. You see where I'm going with that?
Okay.
You see where I'm going with that?
Okay.
So basically, we have to realize that COVID is not over, and as long as you have COVID, supply chain will not improve. If you assume, and let's assume for a second, that 2022, at the end of the day, is a transition year from a pandemic to an endemic, then you might suggest that overall, the supply chain story will ease, and that's exactly what's starting to happen if you look at the cost of shipping and other things. It will take a while, and the risk is that it will not be fast enough to prevent the Bank of Canada from raising interest rates too much. And every economic recession in the past 30, 40 years was helped, if not caused, by a monetary policy error when central bankers raise interest rates way too much. That's the story.
Okay. I am curious to know, it sounds like we are in for a number of interest rate announcements in our future. Do we have an idea of how many we can expect this year, perhaps how many we can perhaps see next year? I know it seems like everyone is glued to their screens or to papers or to Twitter when there's an announcement being made.
Yes, the Bank of Canada is helping us here, and basically they're telling us we are not done. And they use very interesting language. They said, future interest rate increases, with S at the end, which means that this is not the only one.
Plural, right.
So something is happening here, and they're probably willing to take interest rates close to 4%. We're at 3.25 now, in order to make sure that inflation is under control. And this can take the economy into some sort of a recession. Now, we can talk about a recession, and the question is how you define a recession. We define a recession, in the media as 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. But that's not really a recession. As long as you don't have pain in the labor market, the unemployment rate does not rise, this is not really a real recession. And when they talk about soft landing or even a mild recession, they're talking about the economy slowing down, but not a major pain in the labor market. That's more or less where we are.
All right. In July, the governor of the Bank of Canada recently had a meeting with business leaders from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business and said, this is what he said about inflation. Don't build that into longer-term contracts. Don't build that into wage contracts. It's going to take some time, but you can be confident that inflation will come down. Sheila, when you heard this, what did you think?
Well, I thought that it was a bit problematic that the governor of the Bank of Canada was suggesting that wage increases, which have absolutely not kept up with inflation, should be constrained, and by that suggestion saying that actually they were a cause of inflation. And as Benjamin has mentioned, absolutely they haven't been. And I think it's important for us to understand how the labor market has changed since these prior high inflation periods. Very many fewer unionized workers. Even of those unionized workers, very few of them actually have COLA clauses, which were cost of living adjustment clauses. And we also see that, at least for goods production, a lot of that labor market is offshore. That manufacturing prices that had an impact on inflation and manufacturing labor markets are not present in the economy in North America as it was in the 1980s and the 1990s. So a bit disturbing that the governor of the Bank of Canada gave that advice, and I think it really does miss the mark.
Well, I totally understand where he's coming from, because if you start giving, a wage increase of about 8% a year based on today's inflation, then you basically feed inflation. So he's trying to control inflation expectations, telling you what you're seeing now is not long term. So don't really, make sure that you are not really overdoing it. And I think I understand where he's coming from. Clearly, the labor market is very important here, and clearly manufacturing is very important. But something big happened during COVID. You wake up one morning and you realize that about 90% of your antibiotic supply is coming from China. Something is going to happen here. And I believe that a significant portion of what we are buying from China now will come back home. And that's a good thing for labor. I think that's really something that we have to consider in terms of the labor market. And this labor market is really important. The good news, and that's not enough, but it's good, that all the wage increase that we're seeing, or the most significant wage increase that we're seeing, is actually coming to the lower wage segment of the economy. Namely, the lower your wages, the higher your wage inflation is, because that's what the demand is. We have 1 million vacancies, and all of them are in low wage sectors. This is the market telling you, pay more, because we need that.
I want to push back, and I'm curious about this. Some economists reacted to the Bank of Governors' statement by asking why the governor didn't suggest businesses curtail their profits in order to alleviate inflation. What are your thoughts on that?
First of all, profit is going down. Something very interesting is happening already. In the past, profit was easy. There were three things happening: globalization, just-in-time inventories, and labor was cheap and available. Now the opposite is happening. You have deglobalization, you have just-in-case inventories, not just-in-time inventories, and labor is definitely not available and very, very expensive. So profit margins are starting to go down dramatically. And that's why actually I'm optimistic about the future. Why? Because I believe that this decline in profit margins will start creating a wave of investment, the way we have seen in the 90s during the dot-com revolution, that will lead to productivity increase. That's what we need. For the past 20 years, productivity was basically zero. If I give you a 10% increase in your wage and you're 10% more productive, that's not inflationary. So productivity is the number one protection from inflation. We need that. And I believe that this decline in margin will force companies to start investing. But I think it's more a 2024, 2025 story.
I'm curious on that. The Economist recently had an article that said post-tax corporate profits reached 12.1% of GDP in the second quarter, their highest since at least the 1940s. Does that play into that at all in terms of that argument?
Absolutely. Margins have risen during COVID. We know the story because labor costs went down and demand for goods was very significant. But if you look at the service sector, clearly margins were not there. Now the opposite is happening. All this consumption energy is going to services, and that's where we see margins starting to rise. But if you look at the impact of COVID on the economy as a whole, those three forces are happening now. Globalization was very good for many businesses. Now you have deglobalization, which means that it will be more expensive to basically generate a profit. Wages are rising. That's a cost for companies. And you have to keep more inventories because we know that you cannot rely on China all the time. That will hurt profitability over the next few years and will trigger a wave of investment. At least that's the hope.
Sheila, I want to get your take on that. Yeah.
So I do think that that absolutely corporate profits as a share of GDP did increase in this last quarter, and we have actually seen companies, as we would expect them, take advantage of this and increase prices and increase profitability. Over the longer term, I agree with Benjamin that potentially those factors will squeeze profits. There is a potential for that, and it's a good news story that we're not hearing enough of these days. But I think we haven't seen that yet, and there's potential for things to go the other way as well, and particularly with the aggressive interest rate increases that we're seeing at the moment.
All right, let's talk about the Conservative Party of Canada. Their leadership convention is coming up this weekend, and the frontrunner, Pierre Poilievre, is spending a significant amount of time criticizing the Bank of Canada about its monetary measures. Does it worry you, Sheila, that the bank might be more politically influenced in the future, where that conversation is right now?
Well, I think his opening salvo against the bank was clearly kind of pushing against the really necessary measures that we saw during the depth of the pandemic. Lowering interest rates, providing supports, and that kind of quantitative easing that we saw. More recently, the only point that I might agree with him on was that he was critical of the governor's statement on wage increases. I am unconvinced sometimes about whose interests are being served by the independence of the Bank of Canada. I think some of that independence is trying to make sure that politicians who take the interests of their constituents rather than price stability can't influence the bank. So I do wonder whose interests those are in. And that's not to say that his statements aren't of grave concern as well.
Benjamin, how important is it that the bank is seen as non-political?
It's extremely important. Without it, you are nothing. Without it, you don't have any credibility. You cannot really conduct monetary policy. So I'm not concerned about what a political leader is saying about the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada knows better. They will do their work. They will look at the numbers and will make decisions based on the economic numbers, the macro story, where inflation is, where GDP is, where unemployment is. What politicians are saying, meaningless as far as the Bank of Canada is concerned.
All right. I want to change gears a little bit. I want to talk about housing. Benjamin, now the interest rates are climbing, so are monthly mortgage payments for millions of homeowners. Housing prices across the country are cooling, if not falling in some places. And it's still out of reach for many young people. Do you see this changing at all?
The short answer is no. I think that if Toronto and Vancouver were unaffordable before the crisis, they will be unaffordable, unfortunately, after the crisis. We have to fix it. We have to realize that the reason why home prices went up by 48% during COVID was the asymmetrical nature of this crisis. You know, all the jobs that were lost were low-paying jobs, renters mostly, and you have a situation in which home buyers, potential home buyers, their income was there, their job was there, they were zooming, and interest rates went to the basement. So there was a sense of urgency to get into the market, and that's exactly what happened. So what we did, we basically borrowed activity from the future. You know, we got the benefit of a recession without the cost of a recession, namely a decline in interest rates without a significant increase in the unemployment rate. That's something that I've never seen before. And that's the reason why the housing market has been on fire. Now the opposite is happening. Interest rates are rising, which means that the future has arrived. But it's just an allocation of activity over time. So the decline in home prices now is a very welcome development.
Right.
We need that. We go back to semi-normal, but it doesn't mean that the housing market will be affordable. We still have major issues, and actually it's going to get worse. Why? Construction costs rising, labor is unavailable. We know that in Toronto, for example, 1/3 of new projects are being cancelled. So 2 years from now, when the fog clears and people are ready to buy, the supply will not be there. Guess what will happen to prices? That worries me very much.
Sheila, I want to get your take on that. And, are we concerned that the rising interest rates might push people into mortgage default?
So I think there is absolutely a potential for that. And in particular, if you look at levels of private debt, they're at levels that we haven't seen before with these kinds of interest rate increases. You know, I think we have to really broaden the lens a little bit. So I agree with Benjamin that there's no improvement in affordability because of that increase in interest rates. And also because of the increased economic uncertainty, and we don't know, where the recession will land or how it will land. But I think we also have to take a look and say, who needs housing, who is having very difficult access to housing, and how do we protect the people who are most vulnerable, which are renters. And so we need things like more effective rent controls. We need more social housing to be built. We need more nonprofit housing to be built. And we need to take that pressure off of home ownership and really increase access to stable housing to people who cannot get into these kinds of markets.
All right. In the last 2 minutes, I want to ask you both one question. Sheila, I'll come to you first. The Bank of Canada has been walking this tightrope, trying to, increase these rates, cool the economy without pushing us into a recession. We've tossed around the word recession here a couple of times. How successful do you think they have been so far, or is a recession in our near future?
I think the likelihood is that a recession is in the near future, but I think what we really have to do is broaden the government response. And so what we need is not only to be relying on the Bank of Canada and this very blunt instrument of interest rate increases. We need the government to come in to protect low-income people more effectively through this. And of course, the lowest income people are those who are on social assistance. We need strengthening of the competition policy so that corporations can't take advantage of the situation in ways that some have speculated that they have. And we really need to look at what are the drivers. And part of that is really looking at the climate crisis, how it's driving that, and what the appropriate policy response is. And so I think to summarize, I don't think we can expect the Bank of Canada on its own to successfully deal with the complexity of what's going on at the moment.
Benjamin, you got the last word.
Totally agree. I think that the Bank of Canada cannot control where the economy will go, and especially people at the margin. We need government involvement here. I do believe that the risk of a recession is significant, but the question is how you define a recession. As long as you don't have major pain in the labor market, I think we will be okay. But I think that we will see over the next few quarters negative economic growth due to higher interest rates. That will be okay. That will be a reset for the economy as long as the labor market remains healthy. If that's not the case, we need help coming from the government.
All right, something we will definitely keep our eye on. Benjamin, Sheila, thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight.
Thanks for having me.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, September 8th, 2022. Tomorrow, we'll get reaction to the provincial government's Bill 7 controversy. Bill 7 purports to give hospitals the tools to send acute care patients to long-term care facilities. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. We'll see you again here tomorrow. Now, because of the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, TVO is preempting our planned programming tonight to air the two-part documentary Queen of the World. It is an intimate two-part doc released for the 65th anniversary of her reign, and we'll have both episodes for you up next.